start? Okay. So we did our project on clothing and fashion in the 17th century to the 20th century.
So this is our thesis statement. Most fashion development over past centuries has been a result of large-scale events including political issues, wars, and inventions, which affected availability of resources, political leaders' involvement in the arts, and individuals making influential developments. So we found that fashion was an extremely broad topic, so we had a hard time choosing which aspect we would do our research on. But we decided to do it on the biggest developments and the things that had the largest effect on the development of fashion. So some major events we'll be focusing on are ones in the 17th century, which are the Rough, Cavaliers versus the Roundheads, and King Louis XIV.
In the 18th century, we'll be focusing on children's clothing and the sewing machine.
In the 19th century, we'll be focusing on the invention of the corset, the hoop skirt, and the zipper.
And the 20th century, we'll be focusing on World War I, World War II, and pants for women. So we'll be starting with the 17th century.
So the ruff. The ruff is a type of collar that was popular from the 1560s to the 1620s. Mostly it was a symbol of wealth and high social class in society. So this was the reason why the ruff kept growing. In that time, people wanted to outdo each other and have a high, be thought of as being in a high social class. So everyone wanted to have the biggest collar. They were very expensive and elaborately made, and both men and women wore them. So since they kept getting larger and larger, eventually it was just too hard to wear around your neck. So people decided to settle for something called the falling band collar, or called the loose lace collar. We thought this was a really interesting topic to cover because it kind of shows in a small scale the development of fashion and how quickly it can change and how quickly it can change back.
So now I'm going to talk about the Cavaliers versus the Roundheads. So they were both part of the English Civil War, which was from 1642 to 1651. Fashion became a way for people to express their political views as well as their own style. So citizens would wear the style of the side that they supported in the Civil War. So the Cavaliers were colonial, and they wore loose shirts and very long clothing. And the Roundheads were Puritan, and they wore their hair really close to their heads to contradict the monarchy, who wore really long curls, and they really wore anything that would kind of be the opposite from the monarchy.
So King Louis XIV. King Louis XIV was a ruler of France who lived from 1638 to 1715. What he really wanted to focus on as a leader was being involved in the arts through fashion, so he wanted to set a really good example of style for his country, France. But this was not for no reason. It is said that his partial reasoning for wanting to make fashion a big part of life was that he wanted to put people into debt. If he could convince people to spend more money on clothing, then they would appear poorer and he would appear richer and more powerful. He did this by creating a couple of systems. The first was that you would have to have a different dress code for every formal event that you attended. This would cause people to buy more clothing. And the second was that he used fashion almost as a bribe or a way to access privileges. For example, if you wanted to walk in the Versailles Gardens, you had to be formally and well-dressed. However, his effects on fashion in France were not all negative. He also, by making fashion increasingly popular in France, he created jobs and helped businesses thrive because they needed to meet the supply for the demand. After he'd inspired France to be more interested in fashion and make fashion a big part of their life, the rest of Europe sort of caught on. They influenced the rest of Europe, and fashion just took off from there in the continent.
So some of the changes in style from the 17th century were that it started with very restrictive and tight clothing that was kind of harder to move around in, and they started to go towards the looser and more comfortable style. But then at the end, they went back to the original and more tighter clothing. So now we'll be talking about the 18th century.
So children's clothing. Nowadays, we really would think nothing of it because there's a huge distinction between children's clothes and adult clothes. Children's clothes are really fun to look at and easy to wear and comfortable to walk around in all day, whereas adult clothes may not be so easy to wear and look a little more formal. However, before the 18th century, this distinction really didn't exist. There was basically babies' clothes and adults' clothes and no in-between for children. In terms of the fabrics that they used and the designs that they used to make the clothes, children's clothes were pretty much the exact same as the adults, except for the size. So in the 1700s, people decided that they needed an in-between and for children to have their own type of clothing. So they started developing looser, more easy-to-wear clothing. However, what we noticed in our studies was that at the beginning it was very gender neutral. No matter what the gender, children will be put into dresses from a young age for the first few years of their life, particularly the slip dress for the first 0 to 5 months. It was only until the later 18th century or around the 1770s that the genders were really separated and breeches, a type of pants, were introduced for younger males as well as older ones. Another thing that we may recognize from today's society was that the colors pink and blue were introduced as stereotypical colors for boys' and girls' clothes.
So now I'll be talking about the sewing machines. And sewing machines were introduced in 1790. They were very important to the growth of fashion and led to many fashion breakthroughs. It made it possible to have different types of clothing and different styles, so fashion popularity grew dramatically. And businesses also thrived because they could not only make new styles, but also keep up with the demand with their supply, and so many people spent much more money on clothing. But some seamstresses saw sewing machines as a threat to their talent because they spent years trying to be good at sewing and making themselves really good at it, and now there's just a machine that can do it for them. So they thought that was bad, but many others thought that it was amazing because they could go out and pursue other things instead of just sitting at home sewing all day. And sewing machines weren't just used for the sewing industry, or the clothing industry, but they were also used for upholstery, automobile seats, curtains and drapes, towels, toys, and even books. And they motivated companies to experiment with technology.
So a recap of all the things that influenced 18th century fashion and how everything changed. At the beginning, clothing was very elaborate and rich looking with lots of detail. And although throughout the century, as this tailor skill increased because people were getting a better and better education of how to make clothing, people decided to go toward the simpler side. So even though they could have more elaborate clothing, the trends just tended to go towards simple clothing. The 19th century.
So corsets were introduced in the 19th century, and at first they were only worn certain years depending on what the trends were that year, but then they became more and more popular in the 1840s. This was because the hourglass figure became very popular and everybody wanted to achieve it, so they wore corsets so that they could get that figure. There was, however, a corset controversy, which was it prompted vanity, foolishness, and also it could be harmful to your health because it would squeeze your organs and bones around your midsection together, which could be harmful to health. So some people were very against corsets, but many others continued to wear it. And some women would even write letters to publications to express their views on corsets.
So hoop skirts. Hoop skirts were also known as crinolines and were introduced around the 1850s. They were mostly made for practical reasons, such as to keep women from tripping over their skirts, since in that time, the skirts on dresses were very, very large. They were very popular to be worn with corsets, as we said before, corsets were popular around the same time, but they were also made to make skirts look larger and grander. So in the daytime, women would wear smaller crinolines to be able to move around easier, and during formal events, they would wear larger ones because they thought the bigger the better. Another practical reason that crinolines were made and worn was because it would help keep women's legs cool in the summer. There was lots of fabric attached to the skirts on dresses, so having them on their legs would keep them very hot. Although it was a large part of fashion and it was worn by many, the fad died down only a couple decades later because of the fact that it was very hard for women to maneuver in them. It was hard for them to fit through doors and even sit down.
So the zipper was also part of this century, and it was invented by Whitcomb L. Judson in 1851, and they were made to be a faster way to join two materials together. It was originally called the clasp blocker, but then later its name changed to the zipper as we know it to be today, and it led to many other inventions such as Velcro. At the beginning, it wasn't very successful, and it took a while to really take off in the fashion industry, but now, as we can see, if you look around, many people are wearing zippers right now. They were first actually used to close the space between one side of the shoe and the other on the clasps so that the shoe would stay closed, but now are used for many articles of clothing. And they are also being used for surgical reasons right now.
So a recap of the changes in style from the 19th century, and this is how all the inventions were put into effect, and this is what caused the changes in style. So it started off with very tight, slim, and restrictive clothing, as we talked about with the corsets and the crinolines. But then in the middle of the century, it went to very more puffy, elaborate, and very rich-looking clothes with intricate designs. At the end of the century, it reverted back to the original with restrictive and slim clothing. The 20th century.
So I'm going to start off this with World War I and World War II. So World War I was 1914 to 1918, and World War II was 1939 to 1945. Fashion was very influenced by the availability of resources in this time, as obviously, since there was wars, all of their resources were going to help the soldiers and help the wars, and there wasn't a lot for very elaborate clothing. Colors also became very somber, as it wasn't a very joyous time. It was quite a, devastating time because many lives were ended. And clothing became much simpler, as I said, because of the availability of resources, and they didn't want to use all of their available supplies to make extravagant dresses when that wasn't very mandatory. Fashion also became very inspired by the military dress and what the soldiers would wear, so it would kind of follow that trend. And also, referring back to our thesis statement, this shows how the availability of resources would affect how fashion changed.
So pants for women, we think was one of the most influential decisions of the last few centuries. As it's hard to picture now, since most of the women in society that we see out in public are walking around in pants, it originally wasn't allowed before the 20th century. In fact, the first woman to wear pants in public was jailed for what back then was considered to be a very, very serious offense. The charges were later dropped, but it just showed a symbol of how serious they did take the matter. So the reason that women started to tend to wear pants was mostly because they were a comfortable and easier way to move around, but also because when their husbands went off to war, they started wearing their clothes. This was because of something called clothing allowance. So clothing allowance is when the government pays and reimburses you for the clothes that you received to work in. So if they were wearing their husband's clothes that their husbands had worked in, the government would reimburse them, and those clothes were free. So they could spend that money on other things rather than buying new extravagant dresses. The first type of women to wear pants was usually women who worked a lot, specifically who had jobs as pilots or other things. And the rest of the women who didn't really work as much just caught on because it was a comfortable way to move around. So in 1993, it was really established that women were allowed to wear pants, as they were officially allowed to wear trousers on the U.S. Senate floor. But I think the biggest thing about pants for women was that it symbolized something else. It symbolized women's freedom and their ability to do other things that only men could do at that time, such as have important jobs such as doctors and lawyers, and it also sprung the idea that women would be able to vote.
So for the changes in style in the 20th century, there were really new fashions and trends every decade, and there were so many changes that it's really hard to categorize the fashion. And, as we know now, fashion changes constantly. We've already been alive for so many different trend changes and stuff like that. And so it shows how often fashion can really change. So it's really hard to, categorize this century into one little bit.
Yeah, so as we come to the end of our presentation, we just wanted to show what a drastic change all of these new inventions, political issues, and wars can be put into effect, and how those really do affect the development of fashion. So here are pictures of what might have been in trend at the beginning of the 17th century and what was in the trends at the end of the 20th century, as well as pictures for women. So it just really shows how everything really did affect the development of fashion.
So here's our thesis statement again, and so maybe it makes a little bit more sense now. So most fashion development over past centuries has been a result of large-scale events, including political issues, wars, and inventions, which affected the availability of resources, political leaders' involvement in the arts, and individuals making influential developments. So maybe that, as we talked, that made a little bit more sense.
Thanks for listening, guys.
Oh, that was so loud. Wait, Hailey, turn off the video. Turn off the video. Turn off the video.
It turned off.
Is it actually not recording anymore?
Well, it was up until the last
It was,
sentence.
and then it
Oh.
stopped.
It's still recording. It's just
Okay. It's off.
Screensaver just went
Yeah.
on.
no.
The bigger the better.
You're not leaving.